So welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. My name is Lisa Bronner, and I'm the author of the blog Going Green with Lisa Bronner. And I'm also the granddaughter of Dr. Emanuel Bronner, who was the founder of Dr. Bronner's, the maker of the top-selling natural soap in North America. Today, I'm interviewing Dr. Gero Leson. He is the author of a new book, Honor Thy Label, Dr. Bronner's Journey to a Clean, Green, and Ethical Supply Chain. This book launches March 9th, but can be pre-ordered now using the link in the caption. This is the first ever book about Dr. Bronner's, and it's published by Portfolio Books, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. And it has an intro written by David Bronner, who is Dr. Bronner's Cosmic Engagement Officer, CEO, and also happens to be my brother. So Gero is the Vice President of Special Operations at Dr. Bronner's. He joined the company in 2005, after which time he helped transition to sourcing all of our major ingredients directly from certified fair trade and regenerative organic projects. Organic projects at the time. I get ahead of myself. We'll talk about regenerative in a little bit. Some of these projects were built from scratch, supplied by small-scale farms. Under his leadership, Dr. Bronner's has become a pioneer in the global movement to establish socially just and environmentally responsible supply chains. Gero is born in Cologne, Germany, and has a master's degree in physics from the University of Cologne and a doctorate in environmental science and engineering from UCLA. Before working at Dr. Bronner's, he worked as an environmental scientist and consultant, and he joins us live today from his home in Berkeley, California. Thank you, Gero. Welcome.
Lisa, thanks a lot for having me.
So glad you're here. So first, let's tell folks a little bit about your book. Your book, Honor Thy Label, shares the ongoing story of how a small family-owned soap company grew from countercultural roots to create a revolutionary fair trade and organic supply chain. There are some harrowing setbacks, some hard-fought triumphs, and all of this taking a great amount of time, patience, perseverance, hard work, and in projects that span the globe, from Sri Lanka to Ghana to India and more. And not only do you share how an ethical supply chain is possible, but it's even profitable, with results that benefit customers, communities, and the environment. All of this focuses around the key ingredients in Dr. Bronner's soaps, the coconut, olive, palm, and peppermint oils. So this book is for any fan of Dr. Bronner's, especially customers who want to vote with their dollars for ethical business, and also for anyone who wants to know more about where raw materials come from and where the ingredients come from and how they're sourced and how people are impacted. Now, to start us off, I have asked Gero to read an excerpt from his book, Honor Thy Label. And this excerpt comes from the very beginning of the journey. It talks about Serendipol. And Serendipol was the first project that Dr. Bronner's helped to found, and it's in Sri Lanka and supplies our coconut oil. So go ahead, Gero, and share this excerpt with us.
I'll be glad to. In hindsight, the idea of a medium-sized family company, US owned, going into a foreign country and setting up a vertically integrated commercial scale coconut oil farming and processing company, all without any experience in the business and its regulatory framework, seems megalomaniacal. It was, and that's what it took. It certainly rendered the early days of Serendipol, our project in Sri Lanka, exciting times, often more exciting than we cared for. I believe our story is typical for any team embarking on a project in an area that's new to them. After a few months into project planning, it started feeling less exotic and rather normal to encounter problems, chew on them, and eventually solve them. To be sure, none of us had ever worked in any capacity with three crucial pillars of the project: the organic and fair trade certification of more than 1,000 smallholder coconut farmers, the design and construction of a coconut oil factory for food grade and cosmetics grade virgin coconut oil, the building and operation of a meaningful fair trade community system. In fact, we had no clear idea how to implement fair trade along a complex supply chain from field to factory to port, Yet we were confident that with a little help from our friends and Dr. Bronner's, of course, we could do it.
Wow. Wow. When I hear that, I hear confidence, I hear courage, I hear boundary pushing, but I hear a little bit of jumping straight into the deep end. And so when you see this bottle, this Dr. Bronner's peppermint quart, our iconic bottle, when you see it sitting on the shelf, it's kind of self-contained. Like, it looks so removed from all the effort that went into it. But let's say consumers could take this bottle and they could like look into it and see far away where it came from. What story would this bottle tell?
I tried to picture this, Lisa. I read your question and I thought, what would people see, or what would I see? And it's like a kaleidoscope is what we call it in Germany. I think it's an English word too.
Yep.
And there's just all these little thumbnail photos. So if I try to conjure these up, there's images of meetings with people in offices, with regulatory agencies, with Dr. Bronner's. And then immediately the palm trees come up. You all may know or have guessed, much of our oil is coconut oil and palm oil. So those are palms. And maybe that's something that needs pointing out, that the vast majority of Dr. Bronner's raw materials going into the soap are actually tree crops. It's important because tree agriculture is different than field crops. And so I see lots of farms, of coconut farms, the Sri Lankan ones, but I also see oil palm farms in Ghana. You then see where people live. You see villages. They're all very different, right? There's just a whole diversity of rural settings that we come across, and they all fit into that one bottle. Then you shift over to the fields. They're usually small plots with the trees on them, but there's other things going on. You have people collecting coconuts, there's harvesting going on, there's transportation. And then you see one of the areas that we've always dealt with, which is construction. It may sound a little, mundane, but much of the time we spent just building new buildings because all projects kept growing. So I see, in my mind's eye, I just see lots of bricks, being piled up and turned into walls. I see equipment that comes in and that was installed. And then you look and think of the production process itself. That's something that maybe many people in the States also don't have an appreciation of. What we do is rather labor intensive. And we did this on purpose, right? It's always a balance between how mechanized do you get, but our mandate also was to create fair jobs. It was not just about the farmers, it was about the jobs. So I now easily can see all production sites with people involved doing a lot of manual steps, machines too, of course. It's not all just handmade, but there is a significant amount of people in each of the projects. And then you move back to the villages and try to picture what's the impact you've had there. And it's the people naturally, right? So it's not as manifest as wells or maternity ward for the local clinic or so, but I see those buildings too. So it's a really, I in fact see my photo album, so to speak. And it just has photos of all of these. And it's nice to go back now and picture this is all in the bottle. It's pretty complex. So it's mostly humans. It's people, the people we work with. And then it's lots of trees and machinery. But it's a nice thought to just look at that bottle and just picture, what all went in there into that soap that is in that bottle.
But it sounds like it would be, I mean, if I were you looking at the bottle, just a very rich vision when you see it, because you do have all of these images in your head, and a very complex one. And as you said, so many people.
And I think we should suggest to Mike and David, actually, we do one special edition where there's actually a button and you push it and then it zooms out, right? So you can just magnify. So now that would be, I'd buy 10 bottles of this immediately.
I love that idea. I love that. We'll definitely give that idea to Mike and Dave and see. Those are my brothers, by the way, and see what they do with it. So in all of this, you see the sources of all of these just easily in your head, your photo album. You spearheaded the setup of Dr. Bronner's sister companies and their ethical supply chain. And some of these you ended up founding from scratch. Could you list what the sister projects are and where they are and what each of them produces?
Yep, I'll be glad to. This was the core of the work that I had the really good fortune to do starting in 2005 with a growing team called Special Operations. Those are my teammates that support these projects. Maybe to clarify, the companies I'm talking about they're not just suppliers. We're not buying raw materials. We actually are engaged in making those ourselves. So how does this work? We founded sister companies. Technically, they're sister companies with a serious equity stake, almost always majority stakes by Dr. Bronner's. And so the first one is the one we already mentioned, at Surrendipole in Sri Lanka. This is the first project that we kicked off in 2005, and it was built to produce organic and fair coconut oil. First, coconut oil both for soap, but also for food. Initially not for us, but for a third party. And that project has grown, and maybe I also throw in some perspective, because that's a theme for all these projects. Initially, we just made coconut oil, but none of these projects were ever made to just produce for Dr. Bronner's. My joke about this is a company with a single product and a single customer is just a really bad idea. And everybody knows why, right? Because we are a growing company and our demand goes up, but who knows, whether our demand is going to change. And you cannot have an independent producer company been completely dependent upon just a single customer. And also, it's bad for a company because ultimately you want these companies to be real companies, meaning they actually go out, develop their own customers, establish relationships. And that's become the model for all of these companies over time. And to give you an idea of their size, those are not small boutique companies. So Surrendipole, for instance, now buys its nuts from 1,200 organic and fair trade coconut growers. And our factory is a real factory. And I think in the company itself work now around 350 people. And that's both production and that's administration, agricultural services. So that was the first one, Surrendipole, our flagship. And now it was the first organic and fair trade coconut oil ever produced. And that company is diversifying now. So we've added coconut milk and coconut cream and coconut chips. We're just going through that because the company needs to grow and diversify. And I have a hunch there may be other products down the road. I'll give more examples of this when we come to the next project that we started developing in late 2006 was Surrender Palm in Ghana. And that project we built because we needed palm oil. Palm oil we use only in our bar soap. It gives it strength, just to be clear. We're not using palm oil because it's so super dirt cheap. Actually, our joke is this is the most expensive palm oil on the planet. And you would understand why if you look into it a little more closely. So Surrender Palm started a little different. We worked with an NGO initially, put together a small team. Our demand for palm oil is much smaller than for coconut oil, which by far is the largest ingredient because it gives the nice lather to our soaps, right? You use specific oils for soaps, for natural soaps, because they confer properties to the soap. And that's ultimately what Emanuel Bronner brought with him. It's the recipe of that soap, right? That really hasn't changed too much over the last decade. So back to Ghana, palm oil was what we needed. Everybody knows palm oil is the oil of the devil, right? You can't use it because it destroys, tropical forests. And the way it's mostly done nowadays, it does. And of course, our mandate was not to do that, to produce palm oil that was organic and fair. Did we know what we were talking about? No, we did not. So we started out and set up a company, small, and that has grown over the last 14 years now to where we also have a mill, a growing, sizable mill, total staff 350. some 600-700 farmers now supplying palm fruits, but increasingly also cocoa. And cocoa is another example of diversification. All these projects are located in places where you can grow all kinds of things and not just the material that we need. You certify the entire project, all the farmers, organic and fair, and the question comes up, well, can these projects not also produce other agricultural goods? And in Ghana, because cocoa is one of their main crops, the question come up, can we produce organic cocoa? And we had customers for that. In fact, there was a German company who started buying palm oil from us. They were also interested in organic cocoa. We said yes. So this is where diversification started. And it's gotten much worse since, right? So there's been a lot of development, the shift into regenerative agriculture, which means just focusing more on developing the soil actually and bringing humus, organic carbon back into the soil for soil fertility, for resilience. This is a process, I should mention, we started back in Sri Lanka actually very early on. And we continued this in Ghana, and in the end then fell into mixed agroforestry, which is a way of designing and planning new stands of trees in mixed tree cultures, permaculture, with other crops engaged. Why do you do this? Because overall it's better for the economics of the farm. It also increases diversity. It reduces pest pressure because there's more biodiversity. So this is one example where we started then going broader on our raw materials. And lo and behold, we think that surrender palm may become a significant supplier of cassava flour as a gluten-free flour substitute. And we're starting to ramp up the production. So those are examples of the diversification that we've undertaken on all these projects. Again, we don't want them to just rely on us as a customer. It's not good for motivation. It's bad for stability and sustainability of a company, because that's what they are. And they should not just rely on a single sugar daddy such as Dr. Bronner. So that's become the philosophy of all of them.
Right.
So those are the first two we founded. We did want a supplier of olive oil early on, but there we did not set up our own company, but rather found, and I may just throw those in because we have our own projects, Serenity.
Right.
We also have several projects that are also businesses and very closely related in that we're usually the largest customer and the biggest supporter of such projects. So the one that we buy most of our olive oil from is Canaan, Palestine in the West Bank, a fantastic growing supplier of olive oil, which we use in both soaps, but also a growing range of other foods, which is dried tomatoes and capers and all kinds of Mediterranean delicacies. So that's
you're making me very hungry, and I'm sure a lot of our audience.
It's on purpose. So I actually get a commission out of any sale that people make today. So Canaan has, in fact, we today had mushrooms with freaky.
Oh goodness!
Coming from Palestine, and freaky is a green harvested and roasted wheat that's traditionally grown in Palestine, and that's one of the products they're making. They're very, very tasty. So all of these are very tangible. So it's not just, you all may think that we're just talking about cosmetics and body care. No, most of these, in fact, all of these raw materials can be eaten. Coconut oil can be eaten. Palm oil actually is a great oil, whether refined or not. And then olive oil, everybody knows. So that's our olive oil coming mostly from the West Bank. Another project, and here's an interesting story. Maybe Lisa, I'll bring up the question you may ask later. So the other major ingredient we wanted in organic and fair trade is the mint oil. Everybody knows that's our key flavor. Right. And we're up to way over 100 tons of mint oil. I believe Dr. Bronner is the largest user of organic mint oil anywhere on the planet.
I understand that too. Yeah.
Others make chewing gum, but none of it is organic. So we thought, okay, we'll set up our own project. This was in India. And the story is really long, and I do suggest that you just read the book because it's well explained. It was a story full of smoke and mirrors, disappointment, frustration, but also great triumphs, I would say. And we had our own company initially called Surrendiment, in line with all the other Surrendis. And ultimately, we now work closely with a company that we helped found. We don't own it, but we are the largest customer, and it has great potential to bring regenerative agriculture to rural India. So that project is in Uttar Pradesh, state in India, east of Delhi. Very flat lands with soil not very rich in humus, and great opportunities to diversify. And in addition to the mint, we grow several varieties of mint. That project grows rice, it grows all kinds of pulses, lentils, beans, for instance, other herbs such as tulsi, which many of you may have taken during the pandemic.
Right, the tea, yes.
It's the tea is something that people swear by. And then the latest product is peanuts. So you can grow peanuts, which are legumes technically. So that project has a huge potential to diversify. So that's an area where we get involved in, while at the same time looking at their soil, which had been depleted by 50 years of heavy plowing and the use of nitrogen fertilizer, which really isn't the best way to build humus. So you had to revert and start bringing humus back into the soil. And you do that by making compost, by shifting your tillage schemes, by growing cover crops. And we're in the middle of that. And this may be an example to say that much of the work we're now doing at these projects is development work, focusing really on our regenerative agenda, which is bringing fertility back to the soil. Now that's something you cannot charge your customers for, and it's also something you don't want to go to Dr. Bronner's and say, give us another $200,000. So very early on, I started looking for grant opportunities, and they exist. And since I'm German, I had some ideas where to pick up some of these matching funds. So by now, I think we're into our 7th or 8th grant now. They're usually around $200,000 that just help us.
Regarding the Pravitramante in India.
This was in India. We did this before in Sri Lanka on compost. We have a COVID support project in India now.
So a lot of groups working together in these. It's not just like Dr. Bronner's as you said, the sugar daddy.
It's
there.
You get donors. This is mostly German taxpayers' money, but there's other donor programs out there. They're typically public-private partnerships. So you put up money in mostly in kind, and then the program puts up a couple of hundred grand. So this is how we've been doing much of our more developmental work on the ground. Great fun, because to do this just out of your operating budget is a little difficult, right? I did not burden Dr. Bronner's with all of this, even though they've always been super successful. But Dr. Bronner's funds all kinds of other, rather exotic campaigns. And so we just wanted to be a little on our own. So that's Pavitramant, and it's
is that the most recent one there? Then there's
one
more Serendi, right?
There's one more Serendi, and that's Serendi Coco Samoa. So we started this in only 2015 when we realized we still didn't have enough organic and fair trade coconut oil. So we took over essentially an existing conventional copra oil producer, started a joint venture with that company, and are ramping up on a pretty small country with 180,000 people, but a traditional coconut and cocoa industry started our production, and by now are shipping significant amounts of oil straight from Samoa into Los Angeles. And the only sad thing, it's one of the most beautiful places on the planet. The only sad thing is you can't get there now, right? They blocked off completely. You cannot enter Samoa right now. So we've been
for now.
For now, it'll come back.
Yeah, it will. It will. Now, what made the difference, Gero, on when you sourced raw materials from existing companies like Canaan in the West Bank versus founding your own sister companies, which stand on their own, but nonetheless, Dr. Bronner's is the largest stakeholder. Why did you choose which?
So, you know, when we started, this was David's crazy idea, was to have all of our raw materials organic and fair trade. So you start looking and you realize, well, there is no fair trade anything. We had organic coconut oil, palm oil, mint oil you could buy from brokers. You realize you know nothing about the source ultimately. There's just the supply chain is too long and you have no idea who your farmers are.
Very opaque. Yeah.
It's super opaque. And even the people you buy from, the brokers, they often have no idea, right? Because they buy from possibly a local partner, if anything, but usually no farmers involved. And that's when David thought, this is really not so good. We don't know anything about the conditions on the ground. Is there child labor? You know, many people it was mostly negative projections that you think either people use pesticides, so the workers on the farms are sprayed with pesticides. So this is when David thought, no, we should, I think, switch to organic. This was the main driver, was to minimize harm. Like the positive spin on it wasn't quite there. Same on fair trade. It was mostly about making sure that farmers got paid a decent price for their products and that there was no child.
So the first push was organic, and which meant doing no harm to the environment. Yep. And the second push was to fair trade, which had to do with the labor factor.
It was labor, but it was also, Lisa, it was about fair prices being paid. And if you remember, where does fair trade come from? It ultimately originated out of the movement to help coffee growers in Latin America where prices cycled and crashed often so bad on coffee and its supply, that with the money they received, they just couldn't make a living. You could not just make a living, but you were stuck with the crop, right? So this is how fair trade originated. So it was really very strongly focused on farmers. And so when we started this idea of going fair trade, it was mostly about making sure labor conditions are okay and no kids are being used in the farms, but it was also about the prices paid to the farmers. And then we started looking around for raw materials. Well, they were not even standards for coconut, palm, olive, and mint oils. And that was largely the certification process that what's called now Fair Trade International, or FLO, had. We looked at this and they said, well, you know, come back in 5 years and maybe we have standards for coconut oil. And we didn't want to wait. And there was, of course, nothing commercially available because there were no standards. And this is when we just went overboard. And because I was fortunate enough to have potential partners in Sri Lanka from development work, David said, well, you know, let's just build our own mill, our own coconut mill, which is what I was referring to when I read earlier on. We had never done this before. I knew Sri Lanka. I had trust in the partners, and that paid off significantly. And then the rest, you know, Gordon and Sonali knew the coconut industry, but they didn't know food. They didn't know certification. Neither did I. But we were confident that we could do this. So we built these companies because there were no commercial supplies and there were not even standards. Fortunately, then at the time, there were new certification systems that came into play, and we were able to then certify what we did and ultimately build smallholder systems with farmers, factories, and then surrounding community development and fair trade schemes.
Right.
We started these projects, Lisa, because there was just nothing around, and you had to do that. And we were crazy enough to think we could do that.
Right, because I mean, maybe you had the right balance of I don't know, naivete and expertise. And as I said, a whole lot of courage thrown in there. So you're hearing from Gero's reminiscences about his work, that there's a lot of nitty gritty work about funding and relationships and meetings, and then a lot of on the ground work, you know, amidst the farms and the coconut trees and the palm trees and the mint fields as well. As I'm listening to Gero, I'm able to picture what he's talking about. I've been to Sri Lanka, but I've also watched the excellent video Journey to Pavitramente, which just it shows you the mint farm and production in India, and it's just gorgeous. So as a follow-up, you can go check out that video. Now, we've talked about organic, which was almost 20 years ago. That was like the catch, the big thing, the big push. Then it was fair trade because organic wasn't quite enough, and then fair trade. But now we've moved on to something more. And this is Gero's work and the work of his special ops team really put feet on the ground underneath the most recent movement. And it is to regenerative organic. Now, Gero's already alluded to this. Gero, you talked about the land in India and how it was very depleted and how they needed to restore the humus and the organic content in the soil to bring the carbon out of the air where it is a greenhouse gas and put it into the soil where it's actually useful. So how has the regenerative organic standard pushed what you've done, forced you maybe to make certain choices, and just been part of the story of the supply chain development?
It's really the other way around how it happened is, and I'll try to keep it really brief because I could just talk about this for hours. So remember, our initial mandate was to have certified organic and certified fair trade production. And really quickly you realize what organic means mostly nowadays is that farmers cannot use chemical fertilizer, synthetic pesticides, and herbicides. That's right. What organic often is nowadays. That was not the idea though. The original idea of organic was to improve fertility of the soil with natural means, not using fertilizer, chemical, for instance. And we were lucky enough in Sri Lanka to have an inspector early on who said, Gero, most of those coconut trees, they're organic by neglect, is the joke, right? You don't do anything, they're organic, but that's not organic. And he said, if I continue to inspect you, you better want to implement some soil fertility programs. And this is where I got this kick. And ultimately, and it started in 2007. That's what we did on all projects, is to start thinking, how can you improve the soil fertility of tree culture? So there we did start early with mulching, right? You don't burn anything on the field. You collect your materials, you mulch it such that it can decay and go back into humus. You weed regularly and use the weeds for mulching. So those were the first steps. Then pretty swiftly we set up a composting operation and started distributing subsidized compost because you need to bring nutrients back to the soil. And so we were aware pretty early on that organic isn't just about not spraying. We also made the connection pretty swiftly between income and soil fertility, because the yields on most of those coconut fields, and that's true across all crops in the tropics, notably with tree crops, because people take them for granted. Your yields suck, and thus the income per acre is also not the greatest. So we just made that connection that improving soil fertility is as important for fair trade as it is to pay a premium on the price to the farmers. So this didn't take us too long, honestly. After a couple of years, you realized if you do organic and fair trade, the match is fantastic. But in addition to that, you need to support farmers in soil fertility. And that's done differently in field crops than with tree crops. Naturally, I talked about how we do this in field crops in India, just flat land. And so when regenerative agriculture became a real hot topic in the United States in 2015, we were pretty well prepared because we had done this already. This was really
right. That you didn't have to change. You were, it was just kind of already stamped. Yeah.
We had to accelerate. And then David picked up on this. He had watched what we did, and he knew that this was not just about not spraying and just paying a better price, because it's boring. But ultimately, want to bring about change, and change in this case just meant shifting to ways of agriculture that improve soil fertility for many reasons, yield being one, soil resilience being another one. So that's ultimately how we fell into regenerative. So it was really very satisfying to see that America started talking about, oh, we're going to create a regenerative standard. And we were in a really good position to be guinea pigs for the first trial audit. So 3 of our projects already are regenerative certified. And so what's regenerative in that standard to us? It's a combination of the organic mandate not to use chemical inputs. Second, to meet all social standards, and social standards refers to the farmers, the prices you pay to make sure that farm workers receive minimum wages. And you also, of course, look at factory workers in processing. You want to make sure that they benefit. It's not just about the farmers, it's about the entire supply chain. So all that we did have in place. So our shift to regenerative wasn't that difficult. It just helped us accelerate our programs going into mixed agroforestry, for instance, has been an important one, or the compost culture in India. So that's really been regenerative for us. It was
Right.
a natural process to go from organic and fair to regenerative, which incorporates everything, plus animal welfare, important aspect, not so important for us, and then helps rebuild soil, because it helps farmers, but it can, if you do it well and efficiently, it can help mitigate climate change a little bit. I wouldn't
Right.
want to oversell it, but it's just one element in the battle against climate change. So we like
Right.
it's a lot of work. I really want to emphasize this. So it requires training. And this is in part why we get these grants. It's about training farmers, because they don't do this by themselves necessarily. You need to, many of them have just gotten used to the Western way of doing monocultures with a lot of fertilizer, right? So you need to retrain. And I think we'll just do this for another few decades. This is a great way of redevelopment. I know Bill Gates thinks maybe GMO and fertilizer are a better way, and I wouldn't want to argue with it. I think it's just the proof is in the pudding, and I think we'll just go for regenerative.
Well, it's such a fantastic concept, and if it's brand new to anyone, I mean, you dive into it in your book, and really flesh out what does regenerative look like. It is by no means just a stamp on a label. It's a lot of hard work, but from what I read about it, hard work is like the only downside to regenerative organic regenerative agriculture. And there are so many great words and concepts associated with it. You have regenerative, which is a fantastic word meaning to bring back to life. You have, dynamic agroforestry, which is one of my favorite terms. You have soil resilience. I mean, seems like we should all be on board with soil resilience. I love that idea. And so, and it's not just about like giving farmers more money, but helping them to improve the profitability of their own land by giving them, value added crops. You talked about, with the palms growing cocoa and growing cassava, and, they're not just getting one crop, they're getting 3. It's just so beautiful. I love it. I love it. Now, we have a lot of viewers here that want to be conscientious consumers, and they want, when they make a purchase, they want that to be a vote for good business practices. So what advice do you have for them when they're standing in the store aisle, they're thinking about purchasing a product? Why should they care about supply chains, and how should they act?
It's, there's many drivers for people, and what I increasingly like to point out is the opportunities you have to develop. And now, mind you, we're working in tropical countries, in quote developing countries, and there I had not been aware what opportunities there are to develop such countries by doing business with them, but doing this in a way that is socially responsible, meaning fair to everybody and respectful and everybody involved in the process, but also help regenerate the environment. And I believe that's something that speaks to an increasing number of consumers. In fact, we're not the only brand in that space, right? There's many other brands that just think what we do is pretty cool and do something similar. And this is driven by their customers oftentimes.
Well, and I hope there are more brands that follow this example.
It's there's many, maybe we're a little extreme, that wouldn't be the first time with Dr. Bronner's. And I think there's customers, there's consumers who want that connection to the places of origin. And I think that doing business, and it's been, I didn't know this before I started working for Dr. Bronner's, business has power to change things, and NGOs, nonprofits have the same. the nice thing about a business is you are on the ground, right? You're buying things, you're employing people, you make something. It's the basics of the economy worldwide. And you just do it in a style that's different than others. So it's just one way to just get to the sources, and in that process, number one, understand what the problems are on the ground, and number two, do something about it, and oftentimes in a very hands-on and simple way. And I think it's an idea that speaks to people. It's the experience I make when I talk about the work. So I think that may be enough of a motivation to look at what's the supply chain for those products we're eating and washing ourselves with. So that's my simplest one. There's many others. One is that I quite like is the personal connection. The part about our work I love most is the interaction with people. You build and you teams, and you operate, you work with teams, you run operations, and the interaction with people from other cultures is the biggest fun of all of it. There has been a lot of frustration, right? We have frauds, we had to fire people, like it does happen in other countries too. And that's been difficult at times to deal with it. You become disappointed, but ultimately you look back at the teams you've built and you see that with some of the methods that are applied here, like coaching, for instance, team building, leadership development, all the stuff that any self-respecting American company has heard of, you practice this in a different setting, and ultimately people are very much alike, right? There's cultural differences, but ultimately most people respond to the same prompts and motivations. And the exchange with people on the ground, and when you realize that they're behind the vision you have, right? They share that vision, but it needs to be translated into a local setting. That's the other portion I really like about developing relationships along supply chains. It just connects the world. And among the biggest funds are to have people from our teams visit, come to trade shows, or swap people between teams, say from Ghana to Samoa, on projects, not just to meet and have coffee. I like collaboration as just a tool for people to meet. So that's the other really important element I believe of our work, is for people who usually don't get to travel, right? They're stuck in their countries. To give them an opportunity to collaborate, say, with white guys on the ground under collegial conditions is a big kick. And as far as I can tell, that just speaks to most people I've met. And this is what drives the special operations team too. It's the collaboration with others. And it can be nightmarish, and communication can be bad, and Skype doesn't work, but it's all worth it. It just established those relationships, addressing problems, training people. And we often joke, we run a palm oil university, for instance, in Ghana. It involves training. Training is a key aspect. It's technical training for the mechanics. It's teaching people Excel. It's a big challenge. And training farmer, right? It's that training aspect, to do that as part of business. That is, right. I think that's a value in and of itself. And so business gives an opportunity to do that.
All of these things that you're talking about, you're sounding very much more and more like a superhero with your special ops team and all these various fronts on which you have to work. And the idea behind these ethical supply chains is so often, I think it's easy to assume that the help perhaps to struggling economies should come either through the government or through nonprofits. But to help people through business and creating something that's self-sustaining, that's self-governing, that eventually doesn't require external input. I know you talked about grants and such to get things going and train, but this just seems like a much more permanent solution to me. So we have had so many questions come in. I want to jump over to some of them. Now, I'll start off with perhaps an easy question here. Garrett would like to know, Gero, if you have a favorite Dr. Bronner's product. That's kind of hard for me.
I should have prepped. I use, so I've always used, yes, well, in a way it's a peppermint. You know what, if you work in the tropics, it tends to be warm and you sweat a lot, and there's nothing better There's nothing better than taking a shower, a cold shower. There's usually no hot water, and a cold shower with the mint flavor is one of the most refreshing things you can imagine. So in a way, it still is, but you know, I like many of the others. I like the lotions. I like quite a bit. I don't use the hair care all that much. I have to admit, but those two I really like a lot. And then the balm is a great travel companion. You just put it on your feet and bruises, arnica.
Yeah, the arnica will cure what ails you.
I like that a lot. So I'm pretty simple, right? I just like, you can travel. It has to be travelable. So I like the liquid soap, usually the 4-ounce bottle, and then just the balm I take with me, the toothpaste I take, and that's about it.
All right. That's there. So many of them are multitasking products. Now we've had a couple questions come in about transportation. Both Tish and Judy have asked about transportation and logistics and whether they include the local people and environmentally friendly supplies. So you speak about the transportation and logistics.
So it depends on what the questions mean. Are we talking about taking the product from the fields to the factory?
I think so.
You're talking coconuts, right? So coconuts, you don't really want to move around with bicycles, right? You need trucks. So we have in Sri Lanka, we have trucks that are, I think we've got 16 trucks now. And you just picture, they're big trucks and you put some 5,000 nuts on there. They have the husk on it. They're really bulky, right? So you just cannot do this by hand. In fact, in countries where they used to haul or lug those from the fields, we had a really difficult, we actually had to bring in transportation so that you can do this with 3-wheelers, go straight to the farmer. In some cases, you actually need all-terrain vehicles to do that. So are they particularly environmental friendly? No, they're not. They're trucks, right? And they're run on diesel engines for the most part, and there's no real alternative to do that. But then everything else gets hauled by trucks. And maybe I understand where the question goes is, are we looking at more ecological ways to operate this? And we do that where it's appropriate. For instance, we run the boiler in Sri Lanka that makes the steam to dry the coconuts. So that's run on coconut shells rather than on petroleum. And in Ghana, we're now looking into shifting the photovoltaic. You just have to keep in mind that either technologies aren't available and they need to fit into the system you have, for instance. And that's much more difficult than you think. So our primary focus has been environmental focus, to improve soil and social conditions. And then if there are opportunities to shift to regenerative energy, for instance, then you would do that. But it's not the primary focus. Like first you need to run a factory. You just want to start at the right end, and then over time you can improve. So we're looking now into, collect plastic, use the plastic maybe in bricks or so, but you first have to have a production that works, and you focus on your farmers. And then you would start shifting to more environmentally friendly means of making energy, for instance.
Well, the situation with the coconut it's so wonderful to see. And as I said, I've gotten to see it firsthand where everything is used. I mean, so, coconut, we in our grocery stores picture, a coconut's about the size of a softball, but a coconut when picked, it's actually this big thing. It's got this big fleshy husk and it has to dry. And that husk it's part of the compost. Some of the shell is burned, even the cake that's left over after extracting the oil is used for feed. And there's just so much, tidiness in the cycle. I love thinking about that.
Thanks for the pass, Lisa. I want to point this out. I always joke that we have no waste. There's no production waste in Sri Lanka. The only waste there is the water that comes out when you crack. Some people drink it. Right now we market just a little bit of it, and then it's just treated and used for irrigation. Right? There's no production related waste because you use everything. We sell the shells and the husk for price.
Yep.
And the seed cake and everything. So that's super ecological. You have a system that really produces a couple of different raw materials. And so this wastelessness is also an important aspect. I don't like the trucks too much, but there's no alternative. So you use it, right?
But they aren't they are local, like around Sri Lanka, in Serendipalus and Kaliapatia, and your farmers are all surrounding. They're not like being trucked or even across the island.
Yeah, that's exactly. You have to look at the local conditions. You want to minimize transportation, or you even do this for economic reasons. But you can't just bring in 50 new trucks and run, buy some Teslas or so. So you look at this down the road, and in Samoa now Tesla just put in a huge photovoltaic system with batteries, etc., and that's great. But that is not our front, right? Our front is agriculture, efficient and ecological processing.
Right. Now, Gero, there are so many other excellent questions that if I asked one, it would just open a can of worms, not a can of worms, but just like goes for so long that I'm going to see if we can perhaps provide some written answers in the comments afterwards. Unfortunately, our time has come to an end, even though there are so many more things to talk about. Gero, you know how much more I wanted to ask you about, and we didn't have a chance to talk about all of them. But one last thing that I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about, it just was something that really touched me when I read this. You work amongst a wide range of people groups with diverse backgrounds and cultures, a lot of diversity there. But you say in your book that there are some universal truths, and you mentioned this earlier in our interview about how people interact. That being nice is not as exotic as you might think. There's a quote, you say that our guts may tell us that most people enjoy collaborating on projects with a positive triple bottom line, with meaningful work added as a bonus. And now, beyond our intuition, there's a growing body of scientific evidence that humans are in fact hardwired to be nice to each other and enjoy companionship and cooperation. So what is it that you have seen, and how can that encourage all of us?
I think what I've seen is, I mentioned, we've had a couple of disappointments, and you see people being greedy and just looking for the business side of things. But as we developed our teams, what you realize is the power of motivating, and it's very similar to how Dr. Bronner operates in some respects, is to motivate people to do something that provides meaning and purpose. And that gives many people just a very strong motivation to engage and go a little beyond their own, more or less petty sometimes, personal interests, and engage in something that has meaning. And that is, for instance, to develop a fair production in a small town somewhere in Ghana. And there's little arguments here and there between people, but I find that the power, this unifying power of something that offers purpose, just brings out the best in many people. And this may sound trite, but it does speak to what I believe is increasingly being recognized, the fact that most people actually want to be pretty nice. I think we're actually hardwired to be pretty nice to each other. It just really pays off. And our not so nice behavior to each other is a rather recent development, just after the ice age. So I'm finding that projects like this that provide opportunity to grow, to learn, and also do communal things, work in almost any settings. And it doesn't matter what religion this is, right? We're pretty diverse religiously. We work in Buddhist, in Hindu, in Muslim countries, Christian, everything. It doesn't matter much, right? Most people they respond to the same kind of motivations. And if they see there is meaning in what they do, and it's about developing people left behind, for instance, and the farmers are often the theme, you get people to just give their best, even when it's hot outside, which it usually is, right? So even then people do that. So I just found that the work we do is just has a very strong motivating power. And it was very nice to see just last year, a book by a Dutch historian came out, Humankind, Bregman is his name. And it just suggested that ultimately the strong evidence we're all very interested in being nice to each other, and that given just the noise and the confrontation we've watched over the last years, that some of it it's not necessary and it's not human necessarily, right? I just think that people are interested in collaboration, and personally I can just say it's the biggest fun of all. If you've got something to do, it doesn't matter what it is. It has to have some meaning, and you get people to collaborate. So that's one of the lessons that I took home, and it seems to be fully in line with recent discoveries by science that humans are in just overall we're pretty good people, and I found that reassuring.
Yes, it is. And knowing how many places you've been and how many people groups that you have interacted with, I very much feel we can trust your observation on that. And it's nice to know that scientists are validating, what we've known all along.
Yeah.
So, Gero, I want to thank you for joining me today to discuss Honor Thy Label. So thanks so much for joining me for this chat with Dr. Gero Leson, Dr. Bronner's Vice President of Special Ops and author of Honor Thy Label. We will see you the next time we go green.
Thanks so much for having me, Lisa. It was fun.
You're welcome.